Hello and welcome to the Geocurrents lecture series on the historical geography of U.S. presidential elections. This lecture is the second part of the first original lecture, and it's focused on how the United States is currently politically geographically divided. So it's the second half of an introduction to a historical lecture series. What I'm going to do today is looking at how mapping can help explain how the United States is geographically and politically divided, and I'll be doing a little bit of exploration of its historical evolution. This slide shows a cartogram of the 2016 U.S. presidential election. A cartogram is a kind of map in which the size and shape of different territorial entities are changed to match some metric, in this case population. So this map does two things that I really like quite a lot. One is to incorporate population in an election map, and the other is to use a red to blue color gradation scheme with a lot of purple. And what you can really see on this map very clearly, especially in the central part of the country, is a red or Republican rural matrix with blue and purple islands, which represent cities and metropolitan areas within that matrix. And I'll explore a little bit later about this metropolitan-rural divide, which has recently emerged as the main geographical division in American electoral politics. It's not a long-standing thing at all. As I've explained in the previous lecture, state-level maps are quite inadequate to explore the political geography of the United States, or its electoral geography, I should say. County level maps, especially if you just have a red-blue division, aren't much better. So this is this map will tell you something, but not nearly as much as this map, where we have a gradation of the colors. There's no purple category, but we go from very light blue to dark blue and very light red, or pink to dark red. And I'm going to use this map to show how we can see certain geographical patterns. There are many that are visible on this map. I'll just focus on a couple. So one would be a region in the south, two regions that I've shown here that are basically blue or pink swaths through an otherwise quite red region. Now there are other exceptions. Just north of the black-lined area in the east, you can see the Atlanta metropolitan area, which is also blue. But these are rural counties. They're primarily rural. There's some cities in North Carolina and a few other cities elsewhere. Memphis is included. But most of these counties are quite rural. And what I'll do is just look at one state, Alabama, and we can see a threefold correlation here. One is the election results with a very blue swath across the south central part of the state. The second map is a map of race, and we can see this is a very heavily black or African American part of the country. And then, maybe surprising, we see a soil map, and these areas here are noted here as blackland prairie soils. This region in Alabama is traditionally called the Black Belt, and it's black not for racial issues, but because of the color of the soil. Most of the soil in the American South is relatively poor, often quite poor. But this swath of soil developed on limestone is very rich, and it was a region that was therefore attractive for plantation owners and plantation agriculture. So large plantations developed here, which meant large enslaved populations, which meant large black populations. And today, the black population in the United States is overwhelmingly Democratic voting, although there are some changes occurring, but it remains in that situation. And you could see on the two maps on the left, two areas with very low black populations are very red on the map. So there's a real sort of interesting correlation. And the same is true further to the west in Mississippi, what is known as the Inland Delta, but I'm not going to show you maps of that. Another interesting region is in the sort of northern west central part of the country, if you will. We have a large area of very red counties in general, a few pink ones, but a lot of them are very red. And then we have blue islands, some very dark blue indeed. And this is, again, a largely rural area. The largest city would be Spokane, which is actually in a pink county in western Washington. Boise is also in it. That's a pink county, as well in Idaho. I actually carefully avoided Salt Lake City on the map to make it as sort of as rural of an area as I could. I'll just look at 5 states within it: Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, North and South Dakota. And as we will see, the blue counties here are basically fall into 4 categories. And the largest would be American Indian or Native American indigenous majority counties. And we can see there are quite a few of them in South Dakota. We have 5 counties in this category, 2 in North Dakota and 3 in Montana. Let's look at South Dakota in particular. What I've done with heavy black lines is to indicate Native American reservations or domestic dependent nations, probably a better term, and overlay that on the map of the most recent presidential election. And you can see a pretty clear correlation, but not perfect. Standing Rock Reservation, for example, as light pink. But then we look at the demographics. That county, Corson County, that is coincident with that reservation is only 67% American Indian. Whereas if you look at Oglala County, Pine Ridge Reservation, you could see that it's 94% Native American, indigenous, American Indian, whatever term you prefer. It seems to me that the community itself is increasingly preferring American Indian. I'm not sure about that, but there are certainly many do, and so I will use that term. And then we could see Yankton Reservation, Charles Mix County. It's a reservation, but it's only most of the county, perhaps all of the county, but anyway, it's only 32% American Indian. Also of note here, the largest city by far, Sioux Falls, in the far eastern part of the state, is not blue. It's pink, but it's not blue. Another category here would be affluent counties with striking natural amenities that have attracted a lot of wealthy people, most of whom from the outside. They all have major ski resorts, and affluent people who are attracted to natural scenery and skiing tend to be Democratic voting. So that's Blaine County in Idaho, where Sun Valley is, Teton Valley in Wyoming, one of the most affluent counties in the country. That's where Jackson Hole is. On the other side of the Tetons, we have another Teton County in Idaho, and then Gallatin County in Montana. Gallatin actually gets in on the next map as well, but this is where Big Sky Resort is. A lot of money there. I know the situation quite well. My son, daughter-in-law, and grandchildren live in Bozeman. I spend a lot of time there, and the wealth in Bozeman is palpable. Another category here would be counties that have college towns in it. Gallatin's in here again because Bozeman has Montana State. Missoula has University of Montana. That's a bluer county. The wealthy newcomers to Gallatin County, there are plenty of Republicans as well as Democrats in that mix. Without the university, Montana State, I don't think it would be blue. But anyway, Lata County in Idaho, that's Moscow, University of Idaho. We have Albany County, where Laramie is, University of Wyoming. And then in South Dakota, a very lightly populated county, Todd County, city of Vermilion, but that's where University of South Dakota is. So a very nice correlation there. And finally, the last category are former mining and smelting counties, as I say, now centers of environmental remediation. And that's Silver Bow County in Montana with Butte, and Deer Lodge County next door with Anaconda. Butte was at one time, probably the largest mining county in the United States. It was, Silver Bow County, but Butte, the city of Butte, was the largest city between Seattle and Minneapolis for quite a while. Major mining center. The Berkeley Pit, where the open pit mining took place after World War II, is so large, I believe it can be seen from outer space. It's now the largest toxic waste site in the United States. And there are a lot of environmental engineers. The mining and smelting is all shut down. But there's plenty of environmental remediation going on, and people involved in that business tend to be more on the left side of the political spectrum. And partly, too, it's just a legacy of previous voting patterns. Silverbow and Deer Lodge were some of the bluest counties in the country at one time, and also were really noted for labor activism and labor radicalism. And so that legacy has been disappearing. I'll probably show you later on maps showing different mining counties and their gradual movement away from the Democratic Party. Carbon County, Utah would be a good example. In northern Minnesota, some in the Iron Range, there are mining counties that are still blue, but the general tendency has been for these once very blue counties associated with labor unions and labor activism have turned red, and of course, in many of those cases, the mines have shut down. Other patterns are more easily seen in a map. The county level map that shows a red, purple, blue color scheme. And so I'll focus on two areas that are quite visible. And these are both largely agricultural areas. What I'm calling the northern Midwest includes some big cities like Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago, even Omaha. Those are pretty dark blue on this map. But the agricultural counties are mostly purple rather than red. And that's quite a contrast with the southern Great Plains, a more lightly populated area, fewer big cities, fewer cities at all, but there are some. But this is an area that is very red, one of the reddest areas in the country today. It's interesting, if we go back historically, we find a very different situation. Go back to 1892, very interesting election where the Democratic Party and the Republican Party at the time were both quite conservative, especially financially conservative. Grover Cleveland, the Democratic president, was he won. He was president. He won the election in 1884, lost in 1888, although he won the popular vote in that year, and then won again in 1892. But he was what was known as a Bourbon Democrat, which meant that he was very favorably disposed to Wall Street, financial capitalism, especially, was not particularly left in really any sense. And the Republicans were quite conservative as well. This led to a sort of a left populist third party, the Populist Party under Weaver, which did best precisely in this region of the country. A lot of the farmers here were deeply indebted. Weaver wanted an inflationary policy to reduce their debts. That was all focused on going away from the gold standard and having what was known as free coinage of silver, meaning any silver that was anyone had, mine owners, banks, individuals, whatever, could be taken to a mint and coined. That would have led to a certain amount of inflation, but the economy was growing, and it was believed that sort of wages would keep up with inflation and would reduce debt. So you could just see massive support, not in Texas, not in the South. Oklahoma was not yet a state, but in Kansas and Nebraska, a lot of support for left populists. In 1912, another very interesting election because you had multiple candidates. The Republicans split between the Taft Republicans and the Bull Moose or Progressive Republicans of Teddy Roosevelt. And this was also the high tide of the socialist vote in the United States. I have a Geocurrents written post on this. If you're interested, I go into a little bit more detail. But you can see Eugene Debs did best in Nevada, but second best in Oklahoma, which is a relatively new state. And if you look at the actual map of the socialist vote in this year, you can see there is a swath of counties across the South where Debs got over a quarter of the popular vote. And I know Woody Guthrie's birthplace, the county in which he was born. He was born in this year, 1912. A very interesting case because I don't know, when I think of Oklahoma socialists, I think of Woody Guthrie. I mean, he's essentially a communist. He wasn't a member of the party, but he wrote for communist publications. His most famous song, "This Land Is Your Land," "This Land Is My Land," says a lot about his political predilections. Very interesting that this area in Oklahoma, the southern area, the area that voted heavily for socialists, was mostly settled by people from the South. The Southeast had a very low socialist vote, lowest in the country. But when you get to more to the South Central place, states like Louisiana, Arkansas, the socialist vote goes up and reaches this sort of height in southern Oklahoma. By 1924, this southern Great Plains region was split. I have the 2020 map on the left, and you could just see a few blue counties. They can all be explained either by cities or colleges. I mean, take Kansas. You've got the wealthy suburbs of Kansas City. Then you've got the county that has Lawrence, University of Kansas. Then you have Topeka, and then you have the county that has Manhattan, Kansas State. So that same pattern. But in 1924, another election with both the Republican and Democratic candidates were quite conservative. You had a third party, the Progressive Party of La Follette of Wisconsin, which was left-wing progressive, and you could see it did win in some states in Nebraska, but Kansas has really returned to the Republican fold. Oklahoma is divided north and south. And that division continues all the way up till 1996. Bill Clinton did very well in the southern parts of Oklahoma and the eastern parts to some degree. And you can see the rest of it is mostly pink rather than red until you get to the panhandle. And then you could look in 2020. Well, let's focus in on Oklahoma. Very interesting. Oklahoma City, the city itself voted Democratic. The county in which it is located, which is also Oklahoma County, I believe, there was a Republican plurality, but not majority vote for Donald Trump. One interesting thing is Oklahoma has a high percentage of American Indians or Native Americans, the sixth highest percentage in the country. It was Indian territory until those treaties were abrogated. But I put in on this map counties with high percentages of indigenous population. You could see some counties up to almost 50%. And they're concentrated in the east and southeast, and there's really no correlation with voting patterns. So that's really interesting to compare that with counties further north in South Dakota, North Dakota, for example. But those counties have Native American majorities rather than large minorities. So this is something I've been thinking about. There is some evidence that the American Indian population is more Republican-oriented than American Indian populations in states that have large reservations or domestic dependent nations, if you will. An interesting thing to think about, to be sure. Let's look at the northern Midwest, again, historically. 1912, that very interesting election where the Republicans split. Taft, who had the incumbent, did very poorly in the election. He came in third. Teddy Roosevelt, who had this upstart progressive party or bull moose party, did better. Unfortunately, this map is putting in the Teddy Roosevelt and Eugene Debs or socialist vote together. They're very different. They're both sort of progressive oriented, although Teddy Roosevelt, a strong supporter of business and capitalism, although he wanted government regulation of it and wanted monopolies to be broken up. So it's probably not best to put them together, but that's the map that I have, and you can contrast that with 2020. But you can see Minnesota, northern Iowa, northern Illinois, a very high vote mostly for Roosevelt, but for Debs as well. Wisconsin, not so much. And one of the reasons why is Wisconsin had an alternative progressive movement associated with Robert La Follette, a very important political leader in Wisconsin, very much a left progressive, whereas Teddy Roosevelt was more a centrist progressive, right-wing in some aspects, like imperialism, for example. Note that in 1924, the Progressive Party of La Follette just swept Wisconsin with just a few exceptions. Note that the Republican, Calvin Coolidge, very conservative, won in the Twin Cities. Compare that to today. So I put this in partly because you can see how in earlier times rural counties tended to be often more left-leaning than urban counties. Quite different today. And if you leave, again, all the way up to the Bill Clinton era, 1996, you can see most of the counties in Iowa are quite blue. Certainly in Minnesota, this was when Minnesota was the most Democratic-oriented state in the country. It was the only one that voted for the Democratic candidate in 1984. Walter Mondale was a favorite son. But anyway, quite the contrast with 2020. I do note that in 1996, there's a very Republican corner of Iowa, and that is where the Reformed Church, or originally Dutch Reformed Church, which was originally a Calvinist, very theologically conservative branch of the Christian religion, dominates. There's an area in Michigan where you see the same thing. Holland, Michigan, for example, wasn't previously conservative, but as cultural issues became more prominent in politics, it became very right wing. And the last one, I will notice some very dark very dark red areas in the upper South, in Appalachia, in the Ozarks, in particularly sort of mountainous regions. And this is a new pattern. Let's just take one state, Tennessee. Part of Tennessee was in that. Tennessee historically was very much divided, with the East being Republican voting and most of the state being Democratic voting. Now you go back to a year like 1876 or even into 1908, the Republican Party was, in general, the more left party on issues like civil rights. After the Civil War, the Democratic Party was dominated by people who were opposed to civil rights for black people, and most blacks voted for Republican candidates if they could vote. In the North, they could, up through the whole span of the 1800s. The basic issue here was during the Civil War, most of the plantations were in the center around Nashville or in the far west near the Mississippi. The eastern area, sort of hilly, mountainous, not plantation country, relatively few black people. And those areas were opposed to secession of Tennessee. Tennessee did secede from the Union, but afterwards, eastern Tennessee remained very strongly Republican voting. I mean, there were many years where the most Republican voting county in the country was in eastern Tennessee. And so you can see that pattern remaining all the way up through the 1950s. In the 1990s, it starts to change. It's interesting. You could see the Republican counties being less Republican and the Democratic Party's less Democratic. And then after 2004, we get this movement into the modern era. And you look at 2020, the only blue counties in Tennessee are Davidson, where Nashville is. So we have the metropolitan issue here. And the only two black majority counties, one of which is also urban, Shelby County, which has Memphis. So that's the modern geographical pattern. Or I can take West Virginia, which was up through the 80s one of the most Democratic voting states in the country. This is associated with unionism, miners' union, coal mining domination. As mines started to shut down and as the Democratic Party turned more to environmental issues, and particularly climate issues, which is obviously not favorably disposed to coal, West Virginia underwent this radical shift from blue to red. So you can see Bill Clinton winning a majority. This was when Ross Perot was his second election. Ross Perot did better. It was an independent, sort of weirdly populist candidate. I don't know how to describe Perot. I'll work on the later lecture on him. He did quite well here, but Bob Dole of Kansas only got 36%. In 2020, West Virginia was, I think, the second most Trump-supporting state after Wyoming, with Joe Biden getting less than a third, less than 30%. Now, I want to talk about another limitation of county-level maps, and this goes back to the issue of using cartograms instead. So I have a population density map here, and I've noted an area I'm calling the empty quarter. Well, it's not exactly the best term. It's certainly not empty, but it's very sparsely populated without any large cities. And so you can see it looms pretty large on this map. You look at it on a regular county level map. Yeah, well, of course, it's the same size. And then you look at it on a cartogram, and you could see it is just a relatively small sliver. It's very red, a couple little tiny blue islands, which I've explained previously. So in many ways, that's a much better way to visualize the geographical and demographical patterns in the country. Now, on the same map, I want to draw your attention to Oregon, very blue on this map. It's hard to say exactly where the state is, so I didn't want to trace out each county, so I just have Oregon more or less. And if we look at Oregon, we see, well, like New York or Illinois, it's a state that has demographically is blue. If you look at just in gross geographical terms, it's mostly red, those more sparsely populated rural counties. The northwestern part of Oregon is where most of the people live. I have put a box more or less around the Willamette Valley, which goes from Portland to Eugene. That's the main population center of Oregon and has most of its larger cities, Portland metropolitan area really dominating it. And I have another box in far eastern Oregon, so I want to talk about both of those. What I'm going to do now, though, is move down to the precinct level. And for precinct level mapping of 2016 and 2020, you can turn to this amazing map series by the New York Times, an extremely detailed map. So you can, if you look at both of the sites, you could get the 2016 map, which is actually more comprehensive. You can see in the 2020, there's some states and a number of counties that just aren't on the map. But you can also toggle and get the change map or the shift map from 2016 to 2020, which I showed in the previous lecture. But let's focus in on the Willamette Valley, this very blue Democratic voting part of Oregon, but at the geographical scale, it's mostly not blue. Yeah, you can pick out the towns, the cities, Portland metro area, Salem, the capital, Corvallis, that's where Oregon State is, Eugene, that's where University of Oregon is. But mostly red. Even though here, if you look in closely, you can see most of the towns are blue. Not all of them, but most of them. Let's go to eastern Oregon. Very, very red area, and this gets into Idaho too. But if you see the largest city in Idaho, Boise, it's blue. And even a town as small as Ontario, Oregon, population 11,600. Yeah, you really got to zoom in, but if you do, you see it's blue, not dark blue, but blue nonetheless. So this pattern of urban, even small city and metropolitan areas being Democratic voting and rural areas Republican voting, it's very clear today. It is not not historically grounded, not very deeply anyway, as I've said before. I do want to note that voters in eastern Oregon are not happy being largely Republican voters in a state that is dominated by the Democratic Party. And so there is a movement called the Greater Idaho Movement. A number of counties in eastern Oregon, people have voted to join Idaho, leave Oregon. This map actually shows several counties divided because just like states are divided, so are counties. So in central Idaho, for example, you can find the city of Bend, which is a blue city, but surrounded by red agricultural areas. There's also I was surprised to see, I hadn't heard the term before, I started working on this, a Giga Idaho movement, which would supposedly take Republican voting areas in blue states all through the West, in Washington, in California, in Oregon, in Nevada, in Arizona, in New Mexico, and in Colorado, leaving aside the red states of Utah, Wyoming, Montana. I don't know why the authors of this map put no data for Wyoming. That's fascinating. I suppose it's a little bit of antipathy to Wyoming. I'm not sure why. But there are a number of quite blue counties in this region. So that's one of the problems when you try to reconfigure political geographical units. They're always going to, in some sense, miss the mark because there are going to be areas within whatever new entity you want that don't fit. So as I've said before, and I just want to reiterate this point, in most of the United States now, even smaller cities tend blue. I mean, not all of them. In Montana, for example, Great Falls, one of the larger cities, it's not particularly large, 60, 80,000 people, but there's not a single blue precinct. But in Billings, the largest city, there certainly are. But I use Ohio as an interesting example because you can see it's a state that was recently a swing state. It may still be Democratic Senator Sherrod Brown may win, but it looks like Trump will win as well. So it's a pink state now, it looks like. But if you look at its cities, at Columbus, at Cleveland, Cincinnati, at Dayton, different story. Athens is a small city, but that's where Ohio University is in the southeastern part of the state. So note it's quite blue. I note I put a box around Springfield, a city that's been much in the news, and you can see the central part of the city itself is blue. Even a city as small as Lima in the north western part of the state, you have to look kind of closely, but it's quite blue. That's a city of about, I think 35,000 people. Columbus is an interesting case because we can see this nesting or ring-like pattern where the central part, deep blue, going out into the suburbs, lighter blue yet, into the exurbs, very light blue, turning pink, further away, pink, getting further away, yet, getting quite red. So important point to take away here is this is the central geographical dynamics right now. And what becomes then the main battlegrounds are suburban areas, especially the outer suburbs. Inner suburbs have really, and most of the country have turned blue. Not everywhere, but most of the country. Certainly in the west and in the northeast, they have. And then the outer suburbs, very much a battleground. Get into the exurbs, a little further away, mostly Republican, but still a zone of contention. Now, as I said many times before, this metropolitan rural divide is not an old thing at all. Usually it hasn't even really been an issue in campaigns. One time when it was an issue, it really sort of backfired. So I talked quite a bit before in the previous lecture about the three elections in which the Democrats had nominated the left-wing populist, social conservative candidate William Jennings Bryan. But he's one of the few candidates that really sort of make a pitch at rural voters in particular. And this was at a time when the United States was about half urban, half rural. But he had this famous line, "Burn down your cities and leave our farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic, but destroy our farms and grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country." In other words, this is back to the old sort of Jeffersonian line that the farmers are the backbone of the country. They're the sort of the real nation in a sense. And he really pitched his campaign at them. And he lost most agricultural counties in the country, at least in the certainly in the Northeast and Midwest, Eastern Midwest. He did well in the Great Plains, but in agricultural counties in states like Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, he did not do particularly well at all. So it was not a successful campaign. And back to Ohio, I've taken a few maps here just to try to figure out how far back this urban, metropolitan rural divide goes. And it's very interesting. In 2020, I have numbers here for the top, the largest counties in the country by population. So Franklin County with Columbus is now the largest. Cuyahoga County with Cleveland is the second. Hamilton County with Cincinnati is the third, and so on. And you can see that the top six are the only six counties that voted for Joe Biden, with the exception of the county that contains Athens, a college town. So it's a very good correlation. And then 7 and 8. 7 is really an exception. That's Butler County with the city of Hamilton. One would expect it to be at least pink. whereas the county with Canton, which is fairly large population, is pink. But oh, I also notice Holmes County, which is almost majority Amish. It's the highest Amish percentage, I believe, in the country. Amish generally they're discouraged from voting, but I suspect that more and more of them are voting, and it is interesting that is a very red county. But we'll see. It wasn't always by any means. We go back to 2020, and the correlation is less. Again, I have these numbers in accordance with the populations of the county at that time, not as they are today, although it's pretty similar. But you can see the first and second most populous counties in Ohio, blue, and the third with Cincinnati, that's Hamilton County, pink. Go back to 1960, that was Nixon against Kennedy. And of the 8 largest counties, they're split half and half. Go back to 1920, and the 8 largest counties were all Republican voting. And it's very interesting. Holmes County there, I don't know what the Amish percentage was in 1920. I wasn't able to find that out, but it was the only really dark blue county at the time. So in a place like Columbus, you can see this ring-like pattern, and you can see it in many, many cities. So Dallas, Houston, it's very, very clear. That's the general pattern in most of the country. But there are some parts of the country where the suburban areas are almost completely blue, like the San Francisco Bay Area. Now you look at this map and you might say, well, wait a second, there are a lot of red islands. There's some deep red islands here, so maybe I'm exaggerating. Well, precinct level maps, like any other map, could be misleading. You can, with this New York Times mapping system, is interactive to some degree, and you can see how many votes were cast. And these deep red islands here in the Bay Area, we'll look at 1 vote cast, or 1, and 2. And that's true for all of them. Very few. These are, well, there used to be, was an old term in Britain of rotten boroughs, which were parliamentary districts that at one time had large populations, and they no longer did. I don't know really the stories on why these precincts have such tiny populations, but they do. So I'm going to look at Palo Alto area. This is where I live, where Stanford University is, and we can see another very interesting pattern. Yeah, 1 red and 2 pink areas, and 1 red and 1 pink area. The red area, 1 vote, and the pink area, not very many. But the point I want to make here is a very interesting one, having to do with the Andrew Gelman thesis in Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State, which I talked about in the first lecture, where in 2009, Gelman said the Red State, Blue State mapping is a bit misleading because across the country, richer areas vote Republican, poor areas vote Democratic. This is at any scale you look at. And it was pretty much true in 2009. It's no longer so true, as I talk about in that first recorded lecture. But there is, in some aspects, it still persists. And again, I have a geocurrents blog post on this topic if you're interested in it. But it's really interesting in this Palo Alto region. So Atherton is the old money, very wealthy town. Houses on 1-acre lots, huge hedges around them. It has been a wealthy city for a long time. Back when Palo Alto was just middle-class suburb, Atherton was where the rich people lived, if you will. And it was very Republican voting. It has turned blue, but you still had 32% Trump support. Whereas you look at Palo Alto, it's a dark blue. I noted a precinct there right in the Stanford area where I live, 94% Biden vote, 4% Trump vote. So, and Palo Alto is a very affluent community, very affluent, no doubt about it, but it's not as affluent as Atherton, and it's also sort of newer money, Silicon Valley money, whereas Atherton, well, it has that, but it also has sort of the old money as well. And also interesting in this map is East Palo Alto. That's a community that was largely black a few generations ago. Now it's a mixture of black, white, Latino, and a lot of Pacific Islanders, people from Samoa and especially Tonga. So it's very demographically mixed. And it's distinctly blue, but note, it's not as blue as Palo Alto, a much, much wealthier area. So some interesting changes are going on. I want to look a little bit at Milwaukee because that's an interesting case. Milwaukee, the city and the county it's in, Milwaukee County, Milwaukee City, very blue. You can see Milwaukee County, 67. This was a 2012 election. So 2012, Milwaukee County was 67% vote for Barack Obama. City of Milwaukee, almost 80%. There's an American Indian county, Menominee County, very, very blue. But city of Madison, that's where the capital and the University of Wisconsin is. Dane County, very, very blue. No surprise. But what's really interesting are the Milwaukee suburbs at this time were some of the most Republican voting parts of the country. Milwaukee was an area where the Republican Party maintained dominance in the suburbs, even in inner suburbs, much longer than in other parts of the country. So you could see here, Washington County, for example, Mitt Romney got 70%, Barack Obama less than 30%. So this really stark urban-suburban divide long characterized Milwaukee. And it is important to note that Milwaukee at one time was the most left-wing city in the United States. It had a large German population and a strong socialist movement. So Victor Berger, German Jewish background, first socialist in the U.S. House of Representatives. Emil Seidel, who was a German socialist mayor, vice presidential candidate under Eugene Debs when he ran for president in 2012. There's actually an interesting term here, and you can see it in bold here, sewer socialist movement. And that was a term of abuse their opponents used because they said, oh, these socialists are always bragging about their great sewers in Milwaukee. But one thing Socialist Party did a very good job at in Milwaukee was infrastructure. They really focused on that. Was one of the things they focused on, and at the time that was certainly an important thing to have. Good sewers, nothing to sneer at. Let's put it that way. Anyway, even in 2016, there was still a very steep urban-suburban divide in Milwaukee. You can see, unlike Madison, you can see Madison, really the growing city of Wisconsin, like I say, the capital city, university city, but you can see very blue in the center, and then, like Columbus, then lighter blue, then pink, then red. But Milwaukee, you can just see this pretty, like I say, steep gradient still in 2016. What is most interesting, though, is from 2016 to 2020, there is a blue shift in the Milwaukee suburbs and a red shift in the city. So I have the 2020 vote, and it's not like the 2016 vote. That sharp divide is no longer there. The suburban areas have trended to the Democratic Party and away from Donald Trump's populist Republican Party. But you look at you get into the city of Milwaukee itself, you can see a distinct red shift. They're still very blue. I mean, that's the 2020 map is on the left, so you can see they're very blue, but not as blue as they had been, shifting in the red direction. And in some precincts, quite a distinct red shift. And this is definitely an issue of poverty and race. It's the poorer regions. It's the regions that have a much larger Black and Hispanic population that have undergone the shift. So you could see in the race map on the right, and then the vote shift map on the left, you could see the mostly Black area, sort of interior North Milwaukee, a bit of a shift, and even a more pronounced shift in the Latino or Hispanic area to the south. So this is a pattern we see in other parts of the country. Now, I don't want to confuse you. Those areas are still very blue, but there has been this relative shift. You can see something quite similar in New York. So yeah, the greater New York metro area, if you will, the vote shift map. I noticed one relatively small city to the north of New York, Kiryas Yoel or Joel, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, but it's overwhelmingly Haredi or strictly Orthodox, sometimes called ultra-Orthodox Jewish population, Satmar Hasidic to be specific. And that community has definitely shifted to the Republican Party. And that's actually, there are several other Haredi areas on the map. But the important point of this map is, in general, the suburban areas have shifted blue from 2016 to 2020, away from the populist party of populist right-wing party of Donald Trump, Republican Party. But if you go into New York City, it's more of a red shift, and I'll show some more focused examples. It is important to note this is not the shift map. This is the actual voting map from 2020, and unlike the Bay Area, there are some suburban areas that are still quite red. So there's been more of a movement of the suburbs in the San Francisco Bay Area to the Democratic Party, and in New York, not as much. Quite a bit still. But even one borough of the city itself, Staten Island, which I've noted here, is primarily Republican voting. A lot of areas on Long Island are Republican voting. A few areas in Westchester County, but not many. A few areas in New Jersey as well. I'm getting towards the end of the lecture, but one of the last points I want to make is, I'm just reiterating this earlier point, that less affluent areas and more racially diverse areas in New York have seen this shift. So the Bronx is one of the most left-wing Democratic voting parts of the country. It's a relatively poor, very ethnically diverse borough of New York. The circle I have includes Bronx, but also Harlem and other parts of northern Manhattan. But you can see the red shift on the left, very distinct. And then compare that with median household income. And there's another area in the southeastern part of Manhattan that's quite similar. So you see these, and if you look at Manhattan itself, there's a few red shift areas, but there's a lot of blue shift areas. They were already blue and they got bluer. Whereas Bronx, Harlem were blue, and now they're a bit less blue. And you can really see that correlation well. And just like in Palo Alto and Atherton, we can see something very similar. Note, so this is the 2020 election map. We're not talking about shift. We're just talking about the election itself. And you can see everywhere there in Manhattan is blue. Everywhere that we can see outside of Manhattan is blue, except South Williamsburg in Brooklyn, which is mostly, again, Haredi Jewish, and specifically Satmar Hasidic, very, very red. But what I really want to look at here is the Upper West Side and the Upper East Side of Central Park. And the Upper East Side is the more affluent part. It's very, very wealthy area. You could see that here on the median household income map. Notice it's all dark blue. Upper West Side is affluent, but not quite as affluent. And note the voting pattern. So the Upper East Side is Democratic voting, but not as much as the Upper West Side. So it's similar to that Palo Alto-Atherton divide. And it shows that Andrew Gelman's thesis that he outlined in Red State, Blue State, Rich State, Poor State no longer holds, but vestiges of it linger on. Finally, my last map in conclusion would be just a question. How could a country politically divided in such a manner be split into two countries, which many people have talked about, civil war, national divorce, national division. But how could that happen without a civil war? In other words, if you were to split the country along red states and blue states, a place like Eastern Oregon, people are certainly not going to go along with that. And even in red states, an area like Austin, it's not going to be happy being in a new, very conservative red country. And the division is just too geographically complex. It's not at all like it was in 1860 with the Civil War, where there were these stark regional differences. Now the difference is more of a metropolitan-rural difference. And how can you possibly have a metropolitan country and a rural country around? It just doesn't make geographical sense. And if anyone tried to do it, I think the consequences would be absolutely destructive and devastating. After all, in the Civil War itself, that resulted in one state splitting. West Virginia did not want to secede, the people of West Virginia, and it split off into a new state. That conceivably could have happened in other places. Kentucky did not secede, but if it had, I'll bet there would have been the same sort of division. Potentially, it could have occurred in Tennessee as well. As I think I mentioned in the first lecture, I don't think this talk of an impending national divorce or civil war is really as serious as people make it out to be. If a civil war was a good possibility, I think there'd be a lot more panic and than we're actually seeing. We're seeing a tremendous amount of concern and worry and consternation, but I'm not seeing the panic. So maybe I'm unduly optimistic, but I don't think that is in the cards. So anyway, thank you for listening to this lecture. The next lecture in this series will talk about the formation of the presidential voting system, but it will also talk then about the development of the Electoral College, and I'll bring that all the way up to the current debate over the Electoral College. Then I'll go back historically and talk about the development of political parties, how the parties have changed, changes in the nominating process from congressional caucus to conventions, the development of the primary system, and how that has changed over the years. And then the lecture after that, I'll actually go back to the early republic and talk about the first few presidencies up through James Monroe, at least as it's currently planned. So thank you for listening to this lecture, and I hope you tune in for further ones.